The Sega Saturn is remembered as a failure because it lost the console war. That framing is accurate commercially and completely misleading culturally. The Saturn had a library that PlayStation couldn't match in specific areas. 2D fighting games, 2D action RPGs, Japanese strategy RPGs, and a handful of titles that simply had no equivalent on any other platform. It lost because of a botched North American launch price, a difficult architecture that discouraged third-party development, and being caught on the wrong side of the 3D transition. None of that changes what was actually on the hardware. This is about the games that proved the console's library was extraordinary. Grandia is a 1997 Game Arts JRPG whose Saturn version precedes the better-known PlayStation port and remains the original authorial version of the game. The battle system is the core argument. The IP gauge moves characters and enemies along a time axis during combat, with the ability to cancel an enemy's upcoming action by depleting their IP gauge before they act. Interrupting a charged special attack by landing a fast strike at the right moment changes the feel of turn-based combat in ways that later games, including Xenoblade Chronicles, developed into full design philosophies. The mechanic makes attack cancellation a primary strategic priority rather than an incidental outcome, and it was genuinely original in the JRPG space when Grandia shipped. A port town boy who dreams of following ancient explorers travels across a world where civilizational collapse left ruins of a technologically advanced culture beneath new civilizations that have forgotten them. The world design moves from familiar fantasy towns into genuinely alien ruins, and the tonal shift is earned by the time the early hours invest in establishing the world's normalcy. The party chemistry is warm, and the writing is among the better characterized JRPGs of the era. The English localization by Game Arts and Ubisoft was unusually careful for a Saturn JRPG release. The PS1 port that followed degraded some audio quality and introduced load times. The Saturn disc is the cleaner version. Grandia HD Collection on Switch and PC provides the most accessible modern entry point, though it's built from the PS1 master rather than the Saturn original source data. Saturn Bomberman is the 1996 Hudson Soft entry in the series, and the best one ever made by consistent assessment of competitive players across decades. The 10-player mode is the reason, requiring a multi-tap in each controller port, 5 players per tap. No other console game of the era supported simultaneous play at that count, and the Saturn's hardware processed the inputs and rendered the battlefield at 10 players without the frame rate degradation that made similar attempts on other hardware impractical. The 10-player battles produced the chaos Bomberman is designed to produce. Predictable bomb placement, unpredictable human decisions, survivable mayhem for most of the match, followed by sudden elimination cascades at the end. The single-player campaign features large-scale bosses that push the Saturn sprite handling visibly. One early boss fills the entire screen, rendered without polygon tricks, as a pure 2D hardware demonstration in the same engine as the multiplayer mode. The single-player mode is conventional for the series. The 10-player multiplayer, specifically that configuration, with 2 multi-taps and 10 controllers, is the reason this game belongs on a list of Saturn masterpieces. No home version before or since has replicated the simultaneous player count this mode achieved. The chaos this configuration produces is structurally its own experience, different in kind from any 4-player Bomberman. Finding a working setup requires 2 multi-taps and 10 functioning controllers. That remains worth the effort for anyone who can assemble it. Volk Slash is a 1997 CA production mech action game published by Hudson Soft, developed by former Technosoft staff, the Thunder Force composers, and it's one of the Saturn's most technically impressive 3D games from outside the Sega first-party pipeline. Pilot Crest dolly switches between grounded and aerial fighter modes mid-mission. On the ground, a beam sword and machine gun handle close-quarters encounters with weight and collision precision most Saturn 3D action games couldn't achieve. In the air, bombs and a targeting system handle multiple enemies at range. Both modes handle differently, and the game is built around using both fluidly rather than finding a preferred mode and staying there. Each mission features a navigator, one of 5 female characters with distinct personalities and specific hidden abilities, whose efficiency rating builds across multiple play-throughs as you discover those abilities through experimentation. Completing the game with each navigator reveals different endings. The visual scale was notable for the hardware. Large open areas, multiple enemies on screen simultaneously, aerial and ground combat in the same mission without frame rate drops. The Saturn's 3D architecture made this kind of work significantly harder than on PlayStation, and CA production solved problems most studios didn't attempt. The game sold well enough in Japan to receive a Saturn Collection budget re-release in 1998. It never left Japan. A fan translation released in 2021 made it accessible in English for the first time. Hudson Soft's acquisition by Konami means no official re-release is likely. Radiant Silvergun is Treasure's 1998 scrolling shooter and a game that redefines what a shooter can be systemically. The ship has 7 weapons mapped to button combinations rather than power-ups found on the field, and all 7 are available from the start of every run. Using each weapon builds its level independently. The more you use a particular weapon, the more powerful it becomes. This levels through use system creates a relationship with the game that traditional arcade shooters don't. Returning players who've developed specific weapons find a genuinely different experience from first-time players. There are no random encounters. Every enemy spawns in a fixed position at a fixed time, so the game rewards studied memorization across dozens of runs. The color change system extends this. Destroying multiple enemies of the same color in sequence triggers multiplying point bonuses that compound across a run. High-level play involves routing through enemy formations specifically to build color chains while managing 7 different weapon levels. The story, delivered between stages through character dialogue, is more substantial than scrolling shooter convention typically provides, with a story of time loops, artifact recovery, and character sacrifice that the mechanical loop reinforces thematically. The game was Japan-only on Saturn until a 2011 XBLA release. Original Saturn cartridges reached collector prices in the hundreds before that release. It remains one of the most sophisticated shooters the medium has produced. Guardian Heroes is Treasure's Saturn beat-em-up RPG and the best game on the console that most players who didn't own a Saturn have never played. 6 playable characters, each with completely different move sets and magic, fighting across a branching story where dialogue choices shift which of 12 endings you reach. Branching in a beat-em-up was unusual in 1996 and remains rare. Up to 4 players simultaneously in campaign. A versus mode with 16 characters including all major NPCs, each balanced differently enough that the competitive community spent years analyzing the tier implications. The game rewards replay in ways the genre almost never attempts. The combat draws from the Dungeons & Dragons arcade beat-em-up that Treasure's founders worked on before leaving Capcom. The hit detection is precise. Moves have distinct properties. Chaining attacks into magic and throws has real depth, and enemies have behavioral complexity that learning to read changes the game's feel significantly. The Saturn's 2D hardware was the best in its generation for this kind of work, and Guardian Heroes fully exploited it. The game saw a Japan and North American release. A 2011 XBLA remake updated the visuals and added online multiplayer. The Saturn original remains preferred among enthusiasts for the frame data differences between the 2 versions. The Xbox version through backward compatibility makes it accessible. For players who want to understand what made the Saturn genuinely irreplaceable for 2D work, Guardian Heroes is the most complete argument the library has. Baroque is Sting Entertainment's 1998 first-person roguelike and the most formally unusual game in the Saturn's library. After the Blaze, a cataclysm triggered by a failed experiment involving the absolute god. The world has been reduced to red wasteland populated by mutated humans and metabeings. You are an amnesiac who descends into the Neuro Tower to reach the absolute god. Die. And return with whatever knowledge and items survive the run. Death is the mechanic. The story assembles across multiple runs as persistent items reveal fragments of what happened before the blaze. You're not supposed to survive the first run or the second. The first-person view, the stamina system draining during movement and attacks, the item purification at altars, the meta being encounters in real time rather than turn-based menus. All of it creates an atmosphere closer to Silent Hill than any JRPG. They built Baroque's aesthetic from European noir cinema, particularly the work of Jean-Pierre Jeunet. A remake arrived in the West in 2008 and is widely considered to lose what made the original work. The Switch received a Japanese re-release of the Saturn original. Fan translations exist for the Saturn version. The original is the correct version. The remake's third-person shift trades the claustrophobic first-person pressure for something that handles like a conventional action RPG and loses most of the atmospheric specificity that defines the experience. Virtua Fighter 2 on Saturn in 1995 was the technical argument that justified the console's existence for an entire generation of Japanese arcade players. The arcade version ran on Model 2 hardware that was orders of magnitude more powerful than any consumer platform available at the time. The Saturn conversion retained the full character roster, the visual presentation, and the frame data that competitive players had trained on in arcades. Where the PlayStation was struggling with 3D rendering and the N64 hadn't launched, the Saturn was running an arcade-quality fighting game at home. A proposition that justified the console purchase for players who had been spending money in arcades and who wanted that experience in their living room. The engine has aged. It's a foundational game rather than a peak game. The movement options and defensive mechanics that later entries added make the base game feel limited by comparison. But the foundational design survives intact. The circular movement system that made 3D fighting space functional, the weight and momentum that made each character feel physically distinct, the balance that let competitive communities form around it. The Saturn version sold over 1 million copies in Japan and drove the console's initial market penetration significantly. It was Sega's most effective argument that consumer hardware could deliver the arcade experience. And it was convincing enough to carry the Saturn to a strong Japanese launch, even as the North American strategy, with its rushed reveal and high price point, collapse around it. Panzer Dragoon Saga is a Saturn RPG that Sega released in North America in a print run of roughly 30,000 units. The same year, Final Fantasy VII had shipped over 3 million copies in the same market. Complete copies now regularly sell for several hundred to over $1,000. The game spent years accessible only to those who'd kept their copy, creating a mythic reputation that emulation has recently allowed to test against the actual experience. Team Andromeda built an active 3D battle system around the on-rail dragon shooting of the Panzer Dragoon series. Edge and his dragon move on a 360-degree sphere around enemies, positioning for vulnerable angles while managing berserk energy for special attacks. The further behind an enemy you position, the weaker their defenses. The dragon evolves forms based on your combat behavior across the entire run without explicit feedback until the shift occurs. Aggressive play produces a different evolution than magic-focused play. The story, delivered mostly without dialogue in its early sections through environmental observation and implication alone, follows awakening ancient conflict in ruins of civilizations that predate recorded memory. The world design draws from Mobius and Geiger and looks nothing like any other RPG of the period. It's the Saturn exclusive that most completely demonstrates what the platform's unique hardware enabled when a development team committed entirely to its specific strengths. An official re-release has been discussed repeatedly and has never materialized. Emulation is how most players reach it, and it justifies the effort. Magic Knight Rayearth on the Saturn is one of the final official releases in the West. It is a working designs localization of a game arts action RPG based on Clamp's manga, and it's the cleanest demonstration of what the Saturn could produce in its final commercial year when the audience had largely moved on. The sprite work is extraordinary. Large, expressive characters with fluid animation, elaborately designed enemy sprites, and pre-rendered backgrounds pushing the Saturn's quadrilateral polygon renderer in ways most developers hadn't reached. The anime cutscenes produced for the Saturn version were high quality enough that working designs included one as a pack-in bonus with a North American release. 3 heroines are summoned from Tokyo to Sapphiro and must free the imprisoned Princess Emerald. The action RPG combat is fast and character-specific, each heroine's abilities reflecting her archetype from the clamp source material. Working designs, localization, added difficulty adjustments, and characteristic humor. The game is short at around 15 hours, and the dungeon design is more straightforward than the visual presentation suggests. As one of the final Saturn games officially distributed in North America, it became a collector's item before most players found it, and current prices reflect that scarcity. As a showcase for what Saturn hardware could do with 2D sprite work in 1998, the scale, the animation quality, the environment design, it remains one of the most visually accomplished games the platform produced. Shining Force 3 is the Saturn's flagship SRPG and one of the most ambitious projects in the genre's history. Except that outside Japan, almost nobody experienced it as intended. The game was designed as 3 interconnected scenarios, each following a different protagonist through the same political conflict from different angles. The 3 stories were designed to be played in sequence, with a premium disc combining all 3 into a unified dataset for the final in-game content. Camelot Software shipped all 3 scenarios in Japan. Sega of America shipped only Scenario 1 in the West. What Western Saturn owners received was structurally incomplete. Scenario 1 is excellent as a standalone tactical RPG. The grid combat, the character promotion system, the political story of the Senate-Empire conflict, but it builds toward revelations that don't arrive until Scenario 3. The story's emotional weight depends on having played the other perspectives. Fan translations of Scenarios 2 and 3 eventually made the full experience accessible in English, decades after the Saturn's commercial life ended. The completed trilogy represents the most narratively ambitious thing the Saturn's library produced. Running 3 interconnected scenarios with persistent save-state transfer between them on Saturn hardware was a significant technical undertaking. The full 3-scenario experience repays the effort to access it. Albert Odyssey Legend of Eldine is a 1996 working designs localization of a Sunsoft JRPG and the Saturn's best traditional JRPG in the Western catalog. Hike, a winged boy, helps a fairy named Lilara navigate a world where 2 warring kingdoms and an ancient evil are converging. The presentation is the immediate argument. Character sprites are larger and more expressively animated than most 16-bit RPGs. Environments are painted with a detail that the Saturn's 2D hardware could sustain where others couldn't, and the town and dungeon designs have genuine warmth that the palette and animation quality communicate in ways that screenshots don't fully capture. The battle system is turn-based and approachable rather than demanding, building on solid JRPG conventions of the era without subverting them. The character dynamics between Pike and Lilara carry the story through conventional fantasy beats more effectively than the plot mechanics alone would. The writing is warm and frequently funny, which is easy to dismiss and harder to replicate. Working Design's localization is characteristically punched up, jokes and cultural references inserted into a script that didn't contain them originally, which divided players who wanted a direct translation and those who found the result charming. The game is short by JRPG standards at around 20 hours, and the late-game difficulty increases more sharply than the early sections suggest. As a visual achievement, what Saturn hardware could produce in 2D sprite work applied to traditional JRPG aesthetics. It remains the cleanest example in the platform's Western library and a reason to own the console. Princess Crown is the origin of everything Vanillaware has ever made. Director George Comet Tanny left Capcom, where he had worked on the Dungeons & Dragons arcade beat 'em up, joined a studio that went bankrupt mid-development, and Atlas absorbed the team to finish the game for Saturn in 1997. Commercial failure followed. The Saturn was dying, the game was Japan only, and the Atlas Kansai studio that shipped it was shuttered. Comet Tanny founded Vanillaware in 2002, made Odin Sphere as a direct spiritual successor, and the line from Gradriel's sprite work to every Vanillaware game through Unicorn Overlord is immediate and visible across the 3 decades of work since. Young Queen Gradriel of the matriarchal kingdom of Valindia leaves her castle to personally stop a demonic resurrection rather than send soldiers. The 2D sprite animation is extraordinary. Large, expressive, fluid characters against hand-drawn backgrounds, visual density that the Saturn's 2D hardware handled better than any contemporary platform. Combat is beat 'em up in structure with RPG progression underneath. A cooking system lets Gradriel combine ingredients into meals for health and stat effects, requiring inventory management throughout. Additional characters unlock after completing Gradriel's route, each with their own story that expands and intersects the world. The DNA of Dragon's Crown, Odin's Sphere, and Unicorn Overlord is entirely legible in this 1997 game. The style, animation scale, world texture, and combat philosophy are all present in their first form. Wachenruder is a 1998 Sega Saturn SRPG developed by TNS Company, Ltd., and published by Sega in the final months of the system's commercial life, with art contributions from 2 illustrators who defined the visual language of early 2000s anime, and a steampunk setting built around a world saturated with heavy water industrial contamination. Lucian Taylor lives in an over-industrialized city where his twin sister was born with a condition that makes any light physically destructive. The game's tone is appropriately oppressive throughout, and the hand-drawn character art is extraordinary. The steam-powered weapon system is the tactical contribution. Attacks charge a heat gauge, and overheated weapons can't be used until they cool, creating resource management across each engagement. Holding a button builds attack power on a numbered gauge. Releasing at level 5 produces a much stronger strike than releasing at level 2. Giving each attack a physical commitment that most SRPG systems don't require. The camera visibility is a documented problem. 3D buildings and terrain block sight lines from fixed isometric viewpoints, making enemy positioning difficult to track during the AI turn. The game was reportedly rushed as the Saturn was dying, and a short runtime and abrupt ending reflect that pressure. As a visual and atmospheric achievement, the steampunk setting, the oppressive industrial tone, it's the most artistically distinctive SRPG on the platform. Dragon Force puts up to 200 soldiers on screen in real time and runs on Saturn hardware without significant slowdown. In 1996, when most developers were staying turn-based specifically to avoid real-time combat at any meaningful scale, this was its own category of technical achievement. 8 rulers, 8 campaigns, each with different starting territories and political relationships. Playing as Wine of Legendra gives a different story than playing as Tyrus of Tristan, and completing multiple routes assembles the mythology of the dragon spirits and a Madric threat from overlapping angles that no single campaign fully reveals. The real-time mass battle system has no clean equivalent in the 30 years since release. You issue high-level commands, attack, defend, flank, fall back, and the tactical math plays out through soldier casualties, unit-type matchups, morale degradation, terrain positioning, and general abilities you activate at critical moments. It operates at a scale most turn-based tactics titles don't attempt, and does it in real time, without turn structure or pause. Working Design's North American localization was unusually careful, one of the better scripts in their catalog. The game never left the Saturn and has never been re-released anywhere. The combat system remained its own genre. Nothing in the 30 years since has replicated the real-time mass battle hybrid with RPG character progression at this scale. Saturn exclusivity and collector pricing kept it obscure for 3 decades. Emulation is the practical path.